All righty. Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And it's really my pleasure to be here and to share this part of your day with you, whether you're Helen and Michelle, who it's sort of, early afternoon, or if you guys in Europe, it's like, I hope you're enjoying a beer or a glass of wine. So thanks all for coming. When Tivi asked me to talk, I thought, well, what am I going to say that everybody hasn't heard before? And I thought, well, you know what? I've been thinking a lot about how to connect our science so it actually has impact, how to do that, how to move from that discovery and wonder place where we all just love to be to actually helping the communities we encounter. And sort of my journey about how I've changed how I talk, and more recently, actually, how I'm doing science. But before we start, as usual, and I'm sure I've forgotten people on here. I can see Helen, I've forgotten her. But so I'm already apologizing for her. Don't read the list, Helen. The only point is that I'm going to be showing a lot of things, and really, I am just telling a story of large groups of scientists who produced a lot of things. So my thanks to everybody who's put together this wonderful data, these wonderful insights into how the ice sheet, and all the people who funded me over the years. So thank you, colleagues and funders and collaborators around the world. I appreciate so much the honor of working with you. Tavi said, maybe I should say something about how I got here. I've always been the kind of kid who, when I was a little kid, I grew up where it was cold and snowy, and I like to make snow caves in the backyard. And what a cool thing that I actually have a job where, I got to go to snow school and learn how to make a real one. But what I really get excited about is not just building snow caves, and this is one my daughter and I built in the Adirondacks once. It wasn't our best effort. You can see it didn't ever come together because the temperature changed and the top never came together. But it's that wonder of our world. And that's what motivates me, is the beauty of the planet we live on and how we have this remarkable job of understanding how it works. And on the left is just a picture of what it looks like when you're standing in a not quite perfect igloo with your daughter, looking up at the moon. And we're just so fortunate that we live in a time where we can do science, share science, and discover things about the world. Right there, see Helen's kid, you can see me and my daughter curled up in the sleeping bag next to me, staring out at the moon in our not quite perfect igloo. So I've been very lucky. I've, been able to do science and have 2 kids at the same time. So the journey I'm going to take you on is how sort of I went from different ways of my evolving way of how to convince people that the climate was changing and that we needed to do something. There's sort of take 1, take 2, and take 3, or that's where I am now. Who knows what take 4 will be. But my first real effort really was around about the time of IPY. This is an article I wrote in Scientific American, was right when Helen had discovered her lakes, and everybody was really jazzed about that. But it was also the very first time, and I'll never forget this, that I was on the phone talking with Mark Fonstock about how to change our lake paper, the one about the lakes at the onset of the recovery ice stream. And I'm standing there trying to get my luggage at the airport in Denmark. And he starts to tell me not just about the paper, but also how the glaciers in Greenland are changing faster than he'd ever seen them before. And I'll just never forget watching those. It was like out of a surreal movie, watching the luggage go round and round and hearing fear in a scientist's voice. And that's really not what we're used to. We aren't used to thinking of fear as something. We aren't used to doing emotions. It's not really our strong point. But anyway, so I wrote this, article in the way that, trying to both convey that wonder but the things we all do, we say, yeah, ice goes in the water, and yeah, there's a lot of ice on the planet. If you melt Greenland, this is how much of Florida you'll flood. And if you melt West Antarctica, you'll flood this much of, there's West Antarctica, and you'll flood this of Florida. And I used to say cute things like, you can now drive your boat to Disney World. And then if you melted West Antarctica, you drown it even more, right? There wouldn't be any Florida. So, I told this story for a long time. And you can still go online and get, those things that show you how much sea level will change and how many towns you'll inundate, how many homes you'll drown. And I even had these really cool demos that I was incredibly proud of. I spent a lot of time buying awesome railroad gauge homes and even snowmen. You can see there's a little house in, it's a railroad gauge. And then I would take green water and bottles and dump it in and cleverly show you how much sea level would rise. And you could pretend what ice sheet you were doing and how much it would go up in terms of a house, all attempting to convey to people how much ice there really is on our planet. And I even did it with Legos. I tried all sorts of different ways of explaining the polar regions with toys and things that people would really remember. But one day I couldn't find this picture, but it will always be burned into mind. I had that I had the Drown a Small Home exhibit up in an aquarium out at Lamont, and I had a giant ice cube melting over it. And there was a little boy looking into the aquarium, and oh my God, was his face so sad. And I realized that I was terrifying this young boy. And, this boy was, just tiny. He must have been like 4. And it's like, I'm never doing this again. We're not going to use this way. I'm not going to keep on using fear to convey how much ice there is on the planet and the scale of the problem. It was just, what I now know, I was triggering ecological grief, and there's an entire field of it. And most of it kind of says, well, maybe you should go get some professional help if you really are suffering from ecological grief. But when you read through those articles, including like the ones at the Lancet, is one that says to it, we can do social prescribing. We could start exerting effort towards solutions to be increased. So that's something that's been in the back of my mind, is really realizing that, this idea of scaring people and throwing them into ecological grief or terrifying them isn't really very useful. And it gets really hard being the conveyor of, we're going to drown you, or if you're some of my friends who are wildfires experts, we're going to burn you. And then about the same time, not too long after, Sandy came around. Sandy had a real big impact in my community. On the left is kind of what the coastline looked like. There were boats at my boat club, places boats should not be. I was really lucky our boat wasn't trashed. And then when we rebuilt from Sandy, suddenly places, and mind you, I live 30 miles from the ocean up the Hudson River. And this is on the lower right is kind of what it looks like before Sandy. And this is where I keep my boat in the winter. And if you go there now, it looks like New Orleans. The houses are up. The houses are up on stilts. And this is on the Hudson River, 30 miles from the ocean. So people here are already adapting to the concept that the changes here. And in fact, it's not just going, yes, there was significantly more damage because of the sea level rise we've seen already, but the storm surge was really what knocked those boats on the left where they wouldn't be, and knocked out the fronts of those homes on the lower left. So it was really interesting to me how to have this experience of that fear doesn't work, but the change is real. The change and the impacts are here already. So that was take one. Okay, so what's I going to do now? So this was take two on how to see how to connect with the communities. So I still always go back to, wow, our planet is beautiful, because it's this sense of, we have this global knowledge. Many of us here have been lucky enough to have been to Antarctica. We know how beautiful it is, and we know that our planet's really special, and we know how it works. We live in an age that nobody could have imagined, where you can see both poles so often, and we can see change. So, but we also know things are just amazing, whether it's, Helen's Lakes, or the fact that we can see the ice sheet changings. So now when I talk, I always show people the evidence. I don't have to tell you what this is, guys, because you're a glaciologist, but I always show them the very simple evidence that we can see the ice sheets changing, just so they can walk away with it and they can share it with their communities. Doesn't matter what you ask me to talk about. You ask me to talk about the sunken ships on the Hudson River, I'm going to figure out a way to work in changing velocity, decreasing elevation, and yes, losing mass. And because those are 3 lines of evidence that you can show people, they can see it, they can see the changing color, and then you can show them how to do it with their hands, and it's something they can walk away with. So you've empowered them with a little bit of evidence that they can show their friends about how the poles are changing. So, but then I always go back to, I don't leave them with that. I go back to the, yes, the planet's cool. Oh my, we can look at the ice sheet. Yes, there are lakes under it. That's the top of the ice sheet. And anybody now, if you know what a lake looks like, not Helen's Lake, because you have to be able to look at the change to see the dynamic lakes. But, a big lake like Vostok, anybody can see. It looks just like the lakes people ski on. And if you can recognize Lake Vostok, you can probably recognize the other 2 big lakes on this. So it's, again, empowering people to know we can look at our planet and we can see wonderful things, so that they can walk away and share something with their family. So I almost always show Lake Vostok, just because people love to hear cool things and be able to share their knowledge. And then I always have to, the other cool thing I always like to tell people is that science is collaborative, and that the reason we know these things is that science is an international collaborative team effort. And so then I tell the story of the International Polar Year and of the AGAC expedition, and the fact that there we learned that water runs uphill. Again, telling people something that they will make them go, wow, the same way we go, wow. We've kind of forgotten that, wow is water underneath 2 miles of ice, or water that gets driven uphill. But letting them walk away with that same sense of wow that inspires us and gets us to keep doing our job, because that's what we dream of, because we dream of finding more of these these amazing things about our planet. So those, that's been inherently part of my take 2, is in showing people the evidence of the planet changing in the poles, but then also showing them a bit of wow, because you want them to be excited and to love our planet and to love the science we do. It's back to that. It's the same thing as lying in the igloo and looking at the moon. It is simply a wow, beautiful thing. It's just, it took a lot more data and ingenuity to get those other wows than this did. And then I try and explain that not only do we know what's going on at the pole, but we know globally, and the impact is global. And just something really simple like, yeah, we sea levels going up, and it's going up almost everywhere where there's a little arrow going up. And then I show them how we know it. This happens to be the sea level, the tide gauge at the Battery. So it's a place a lot of people have been. Anybody who's been to the Statue of Liberty's walked right by this. And then I try and explain it. I make them think about what it means. So I introduce them to my grandmother. My grandmother actually was 2 meters tall. Not really, but I tell them she was. And that, I have them put their hand just below their knee. And that's how much sea level has grown since my grandmother was born, because that's how long we have a record in New York City. Again, just trying to bring the change so it's not this esoteric thing, but so it's something that their grandmother, my grandmother, would have been aware of, and that she would have walked down and found the beach in a different place. I spent a lot of time trying to link it with cars and dogs, because you're right, people like cars and dogs, over the ages. I'm not sure this one really worked. This is my attempt to show how over time cars and families have changed. Not sure this one worked, but I found it while I was trying to put together this talk, so I thought I would attempt to say how we went from horses to Model Ts to sports cars to little sports utilities to more hybrid cars, and kids and families grew. So I also had the honor of being part of the National Academy review of the last National Climate Assessment. If you ever have a chance to do it, I really would highly recommend it, because what it forced me to do over Christmas, which I had this picture, my husband and I would read it together, didn't talk him into reading it. Turns out I couldn't talk him into reading 1,800 pages with me over Christmas. But it meant that I had to read this entire document about both sectors in the US and places in the US about what are the impacts. And so suddenly I was able to have the language and the knowledge that allowed me to I think, more usefully connect anywhere I go in the US. And, these are our global resources. If the US, you should go to look at the US climate change assessment. And there are ones in many different countries. This is just the one I happen to review. But suddenly you can start saying to people, look, we can see it right here in my backyard, that my daffodils come up sooner. And I can have tomato and basil on my pizza later in the fall because the growing season is longer. That, it's up to 40 days longer in some parts of the US, but on average, it's 10 days longer. And that means my flowers are coming up sooner, and my garden's providing me with tomatoes and basil longer. Again, trying to make this so it isn't something, that the change isn't something that's foreign and imperceptible. The other one that I love that I learned was in the Gulf of Mexico. You used to catch yummy, cold water loving southern flounder. And now you're catching not quite so yummy gray snapper, because they like warmer water. So it's, again, telling stories that people can understand. There's another one in there that you can actually see that the fish along the East Coast have moved north a little bit. So again, trying to figure out what the stories you can tell that make the story real to people, and things that, and getting past, we love wiggles and plots. But if we can tell stories more as narratives, we're going to connect with people more. And then also sharing with them the fact that this is actually the maps, the geeping maps of the, precipitation. Around here, people know that it's rained a lot more. Irene dumped so much water when she went through. You can still see the scars in the woods. So people know that we're getting a lot more rain in the fall. That's what this bottom right is showing. Green is more rain in the fall, or more rain in general, even though it's not the same everywhere. And this is another one of my favorite ones to show. I showed this one in a COVID and climate Sisters Lead Sisters vote event before the election last fall. where we were just using it as a way to inspire people to support science. And this basically shows that temperatures, yes, if you live in the Northeast, have clearly risen. If you live where, you know, in the upper Midwest, yes, temperatures have risen. But if you live in Mississippi or Alabama, it's not quite as clear. You have not had those really, really clear warmer trends. So it's, again, letting people know that our planet is not like, is not monotonic. It's kind of like your refrigerator. It doesn't change temperature the same all the time. So, you know, when I think about who I'm trying to reach, I'm really trying to reach, these are the guys that fix my car. They're Frank and Al. They're lovely people. They keep Fox News running all the time, but I keep on trying to have conversations with them. And when I think about who I'm trying to talk to, I'm trying to talk to Frank and Al. I give them honey too, in hopes that, you know, it'll help them listen to me and try and explain, you know, things around that might matter to them, because they, you know, they love to hunt and fish. So it's, again, when I think about Frank and Al. Then you know, my more recent arc has been trying to convey to people that the climate issue is something that we all have to act on. And, you know, as opposed to leaving them with it, where, you know, the world's wonderful, yeah, it's changing. But I think it's really important, or phase 2 was trying to convey people that it was a moment to act, and that we have the knowledge of our planet, we have understanding of the systems, but it's now is a moment to embrace that knowledge and act, whether you act as an individual, an organization, or culturally. And then I try and give them some, you know, some examples. You know, we talk about it a lot in my house. My husband's written a book on tracking your own carbon budget and seeing, so you can see where you blow your carbon. I know where I blow my carbon. He says nobody understands this, but I'm talking to people who like XY plots, so I can tell you XY plots. The vertical axis is how much carbon, cumulative carbon. Horizontal axis is roughly days of the year, not perfect. But you can see, you know, how much it costs to, you know, the first slope is how much it costs to warm my house in the winter. And then I flew to Florida. I took a train, there's a little kick. I flew to Florida for an AGU meeting. I flew to Ohio for a lecture. Kind of flatlined when I went sailing. We don't spend as much as when we go sailing offshore. We don't burn much CO2. I flew to Mexico for a meeting late in this year, and then we started skiing a lot more, and warming things a lot more. So the slope of that curve went up. So to me, this really made it clear where my big expenditures of carbon are in travel, basically. So, you know, I always show this as an example of how, as individuals, we can take responsibility for what we do. And as scientists, it's really important that we show we're taking it seriously, that we will be more effective communicators if we show we're taking this as something that we're going to invest our life in. Then I show what our organizations can do. Like Lamont has invested in solar panels so that our electricity is primarily solar. AGU, you guys can all use this. This is a pretty cool example. I love this one. This was the AGU building before it was renovated. This is what it looks like now. When you guys can travel again, there's a free members lounge on the first floor with a cappuccino machine. Nice place to work. It's up near DuPont Circle. And it is a net zero building. It's the first renovation in Washington, D.C. where it's net zero. And while it's like everything, it's a wonderful example of how there's no single solution. It wasn't simply putting that beautiful photoelectric array on. It took the LED lighting, the plants that clean the air. It took the water recycling, and it took exchanging the heat with the sewer system to be able to get to net zero. And eventually the data will be online, so it will be usable for classes. But again, this shows that our community has taken it very seriously and are trying to set an example on how we as organizations can take action. I also usually show something that says it's our roles as individuals to push our governments for action, to integrate science at all levels, whether it's, local, regional, or federal. So that was sort of my take two. Take three, I've sort of moved a little bit more towards this co-production concept. And this is an ongoing Navigating the New Arctic project with a whole load of people who I thank very much here. This was really the brainchild of Kirsty Tinto and Jackie Osterman. So I'm just, again, clearly the spokesperson here. They, again, another, story for early career people. NSF asked Kirsty if she wanted to go to Greenland for a planning meeting, and from that, the connections she made in that planning meeting allowed us to launch this project. And the Navigating the New Arctic really wants you to look for something that's natural environment, social environment, and the built environment. And we really tried to look at the concept that sea level is going to fall in much of Greenland due to both the self-gravitation and the post-glacial rebound, and that's going to cause significant impact both to benthic habitats and to infrastructure, and that we were going to work on community engagement. So that's how we tried to link those three pieces that NSF called for. And we started this just before the pandemic. And it was, as I said, it was really Kirsty and Jackie's brainchild, but it also built on an early co-production of effort that Dave Porter and Margie Turin got funded through institutional funding to go to Glacier, sort of the northernmost town in Greenland that you can get to without going to Thule, the one that's sort of at the end of the line. If you go on Air Greenland, you go by small aircraft and then you have to helicopter in. But they had done a co-production effort in that town, and we were able to build on it. So it began with a trip to Nuuk in about 18 months ago in January, where we went, and at the time I was wondering why are we taking so many people to Greenland to plan? And now, particularly given that we had a pandemic, I'm so glad that 7 of us went and spent up to a week there, really building relationships. Margie and Kirsty, you can see them right here, and Dave ended up spending the weekend there, where there was actually an open house at Greenland Institute of Natural Resources, who are our partners, and they interacted with about 1,500 people, which is like 10% of the population of Nuuk, explaining the concept that sea level's falling around Greenland due to the retreating ice. So what is co-production? It's something that we talked about. And I'm just beginning to understand how rich the field is and how many different definitions there are of it. But in my thumbnail, I think of it, it's moving past, let me tell you what I know. Because I'm a scientist and I went to school for a long time and I know a lot, to deliberately building relationships between scientists and stakeholders so that together we can, build the knowledge to live sustainably on the planet and shape the goals together between one another. So this is what we've been trying to do. And it's interesting because sometimes we get it mixed up with the education and outreach we're trying to do, which, it's some of the principles of doing good co-production really focus on being humble and worrying about your impact and being accountable. And I have to say pandemic really encouraged us to be humble, because the whole reason that we're able to move forward, and I'm able to show you pictures of data and results, is because of those partnerships we built in Greenland, because of the time we invested in Greenland, fortunately just before the pandemic started, and that our absolute admission that, you know, we needed our partners. It wasn't something that we were going to do without our partners. And this gives you a sense of the richness that happens during the pandemic. This is Akaluk Sorensen, one of our partners, actually working with hunters and fishers in one of the villages in Asiat, trying to identify where we should do multi-beam mapping. This on the top right is Akaluk and Marina and Carl installing a tide gauge with a class in Greenland. Here is a number of the figures from our proposal in other parts in the Greenlandic newspaper. And here is the first tide gauge actually being installed by Greenlandic scientists. Over here is 2 Greenlandic master's students who went to sea to collect the data when we couldn't. I mean, of all awful things to happen during the pandemic, this one just about made me cry. I mean, these 2 young women who got to go to the field because we couldn't. And it's been a joy to watch roll out, and this recognition that partnerships often mean letting go to the things that we think we're going to do and letting other people doing them. I mean, this is the fundamental science behind, is in essence, I think we all know this, is that there will be uplift and sea level fall due to changing ice, and that it's going to change the habitats. And given that Greenland's a very maritime culture, that's going to matter. We're working in 4 communities with very different sea level predictions. And one of our goals is actually to improve these predictions everywhere from Kalursak, where it's predicted by 2100 to drop almost 3 meters, to Nook, where it could go up a little bit. So you can see, and some of that is, this is where our connectedness of our science is so crazy. Some of this is really due to the poor constraints of the viscoelastic model underneath Greenland, as well as the unloading history from the last glacial maximum. So that's one of the things we're actually working on. You know, that's some of the basic science that's happening as part of this project. So that's one of our goals, is to go to these communities, find out where changing sea level matters to them, map where they think it matters, and then come back and share the data, as well as share the projections. So, this is when we had to summarize what we thought was really cool of it, that we were really improving the observations and predictions of falling sea level. We were able to link eyewitness reports of changing sea level to high resolution seafloor measurements of models of future change, and really trying to do this new approach of trying sea level that works collaboratively with local communities and tries to put, these are all quotes from the group, by the way, I'm just reading you. This was a crowdsource. What do you think we've done? That puts the needs and the knowledge of the community at its heart. And then this convergent approach of bringing together disciplines using local knowledge and enabling frontland communities to adapt to climate change. So that's, when we sat down, and this is how you can crowdsource in Zoom. We had everybody think and then put in the chat what they thought was so novel. I thought I'd just share, 1 or 2 more stories. My first crow production moment as part of this was, I'm a sailor, and once, maybe a decade ago, this couple on the upper right, Dorta and Jans, showed up on the Hudson River. They're crazy. She's our nurse, he's an artist. They don't bother to check in with customs. Just shocking to me, given that we always worry about that. But anyway, we had them over for dinner. We made them paella. They were shocked how excited I was about Greenland, because I was being, you know, my excited scientist person. But she was actually the first Greenlandic person to circumnavigate the globe. They went through the Northwest Passage on their sailboat. And just before this project, well, while this project was under review, they came through New York again on their way home. He gave me that carving. And so I told them about this project. And I said, you know, if it gets funded, I'll give you a yell. So that January, we were in Greenland, and I was being my normal sort of shy scientist. It's like, oh, I don't know if I should reach out to Dorta and Jans and like Kirsty and Dave are going, call them, just do it, Robin, be brave. So I called them. 7 minutes later, Jans was in his car outside where we were staying. Nuuk isn't very big, so it really only took 7 minutes for him to drive up. And he took me down to the birthday party of his daughter-in-law, the woman here in the red, with the second from the left, you know, and we were having, you know, they shared caribou, that the first caribou his grandson, the one on the floor, had ever shot. And they welcomed me into their home. And it was just marvelous. And then the next day he said, why don't you bring some of your friends over? So Jackie and Johnny and I went down for dinner. And then we actually had a chance to explain what we were doing, that we were really trying to look at places that we thought sea level was going to fall and how it might impact infrastructure. And it was just one of those wonderful, it was my first co-production listening moment, in that he whipped out his computer, pulled out the charts, and pointed to this place near Asiat, one of the towns we're working in, where he said his friend, the mayor, says that they used to be able to go through when he was a young man, and it's getting harder and harder to go through. So that was, you know, and it's like, wow, we hadn't thought, when we wrote this, having done bathymetric mapping in the US, I'm always terrified of saying we're going to do anything for navigation purposes. So we didn't really say we were doing this for navigation purposes, but here was like the people I know best in Greenland telling me that they had stories about where they were seeing evidence of sea level fall. So anyway, we'll come back to that in a minute. So what we did, this was the culture night that I told you about. This was step one. The pandemic turned it into this crazy world where Margie and Dave would get up at 5 or 6 in the morning while Akaluk was participating in classes. You can see Margie there on the screen lecturing while he hands out all the, you know, we developed all these tools, not drowning people, but, you know, everything we love, from like Glacier goo to puzzles to 3D models of the ice sheet to card games that show how the ecosystems will change. And this was actually in April in Kalorsak. We had 4 of our Greenlandic colleagues go up, and it's just been so powerful to realize that we can foster the introduction of science and technology into these communities, enough so that people walk away saying, wow, we want to be scientists. And it's not because we're there, you know, yeah, because it's harder for us to be role models, right? And whereas we've been lucky enough that our partners have involved young scientists and young role models from these communities. Here's Akaluk talking to an elder about where, where they care about fishing, where they've seen things change. And this is one of my favorite stories, is that this is the parent of one of the young high school students we took from Asiat to Kalorsak as part of the project. And her father, looking at the new map that you and I all know exists of the bathymetry around Greenland, but they didn't know. And him being able to look at it, move his halibut fishing about 500 feet and come back with more fish. You know, so it was like this instant realization that things we have and knowledge we've put together can really make a difference in people's lives. We love that we left a lot of maps, and these are pictures that Akaluk and Carl sent to us, because they were so happy that, you know, clearly the maps we left were not just pitched in the trash, that they were carefully saved. Here they are at the school where you wait for the heliport. They were tucked in behind all the cups, clearly something you want to save and be able to share, and out here on the table. So again, realizing that strong partnerships, listening to communities, and sharing is just, we can have an impact with our science. So, you know, this is what I said before, that accountability, co-production has this accountability piece where you're responsive to the needs of society, that thinking about the impact, you know, ensuring the implementation of our scientific knowledge and making sure our science has impact, and be humble. You know, I think that's, to me, been one of the very important lessons, is that to do this work, we have to recognize we have to be humble, acknowledge different ways of thinking, and be reflexive about our role in science. You also have to expect that things aren't going to be as linear as they were. The top was our original proposed work. We were going to do community meetings. We were going to go out and do a ton of mapping, and then we're going to go back and tell people about it. And it's turned out it's much slower. It's you know, that co-production is more iterative, but I would suggest it's also a very different way of doing our science, but also as a joy. So back to that channel, I now know its name. It's called the Niviak channel, because those hunters and fishers that I showed Akaluk speaking to said that there's this channel, you can go look at it in Google Earth. You can actually see that it's really shallow. We couldn't get in with the large boat, the Sana, the GINR ship, but they're actually in Aasiut right now equipping a small boat, and they are really hoping to get into this place that Dorcha and Jans pointed out, and the fishermen pointed out, as being somewhere they're very keen to know, because they think it's getting shallower because the mussels are growing more. And it's going to be very interesting to see what the depths are and what the bottom really is. So, you know, that's been our journey. It's still ongoing in terms of how to connect, you know, the ice sheet models with communities and with what the community needs. But it's, to me, it's been a wonderful journey, even if we've hardly left our homes since the beginning of the pandemic. I'm just going to tell you one more very quick idea that I'm just beginning to think about. Actually, we're writing a proposal about it right now, is that maybe we should not just be talking about how to inspire people to take action when we talk about climate change, but maybe we should be talking about how we can bring our science to the arc of solutions and to a new economy. How can we, this quote is straight from the AGU strategic plan, how can we think about, share our vision of a thriving, equitable, sustainable future that's supported by innovation, discovery, and action? And it's one of the ideas I'm thinking about right now with wind power, you know, as opposed to how do we put that in the arc of what we think about, because in my community, I can see it's going to change the coastline. It's going to change people's relationship to the ocean. It's going to change where we think of jobs and how we think of what you do at the ocean. I think it's going to result in new development in the New York City harbor. There's going to be new technology and new innovation. And we should embrace that as part of our future vision of how science can inform our future. And, you know, again, I'm trying to use the same co-production approach in this, what we're putting together to how do we think about building a community of practice around wind energy in the offshore of the East Coast. So, you know, I hope I've given you something to think about in terms of how we might both connect and communicate our science with communities around the globe. So thank you very much for asking me to speak, and I'd be happy to hear what you have to think and take your input on how we might do this as a community.
Thank you very much indeed, Robin. Do people have questions? If you have, just put something on the chat that shows that you have a question. You don't have to write the whole question there. I know it takes people a moment to type on the chat, but I was just going to ask a question about, I suppose, about equity and how we deal with the unfortunate accident that Western countries aren't always that impacted by climate change directly. So if our daffodils come up earlier and our basil grows later, it doesn't seem like something that needs fixing. But then how do we give people, I guess, the empathy to understand what's happening in other countries where these things are really, really critical? Because after all, we're the carbon guzzling ones, and they're often not. So
it's interesting. I thought you were going to ask about equity in terms of, you know, co-production and indigenous knowledge, but this is maybe easier because I think people are beginning to recognize that it's more than just the daffodils and the fish, right? That's something, I tell those stories because that's something people can relate to. I think I may also tell them because it paints a picture that's more than a wiggle, and it actually probably reaches their senses more than just a wiggle. You know, it reaches their taste and their smell. And remember, we're trying to paint a picture of how the world is different. And not everybody sees the black and white wiggles that we do. So I think, as opposed to making people feel guilty, I think it is painting the picture of that our shared future is something that isn't awful, right? That our shared future is something that we want to be equitable, and that we're going to have to work at it, and it may not be easy. But it is this interesting of how I usually show pictures, and I actually cut it out. I almost always show a picture of that when we went to Senegal with my husband for waterkeeper work. We found that all the people who are worried about water quality in West Africa are worrying about sea level rise. And I always show a picture of that. Not in this talk, I don't know why I took it out, because I thought I had too many. And I was gonna give you whiplash. But I try and convey that it's a global problem without beating it over the head of people's head. I think that's what I do. Anyway, it's something to talk about, David, about how we do it in a way that doesn't stop people from listening.
thank you. Tim Bartholomeus, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Robin. My question is, as you sort of move into this sort of new sphere of co-production of knowledge from more traditional geophysics, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered? And I imagine, I mean, some of that might be just sort of getting started with building relationships and finding the right people to communicate with, but what sort of surprised you in that regard?
Well, what surprised me is that, and you know, we have the Navigating the New Arctic program at NSF, and recognizing that we can't take, that we have to honor individual communities and individual histories, and that we have to be very careful that we can't pick things whole hog from one place and put it in the other. So I think that's been my biggest lesson, you know, the biggest challenge is making sure that we don't assume that all Arctic communities are the same. I think that is, you know, and even in Greenland, we, you know, Fiamma knows we haven't managed to get to Tasiilaq yet. And our Greenlandic partner, and you know, those two different sides of Greenland are very different. You know, so it's again recognizing the distinct nature of the different communities.
Cool, thanks.
Julie, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my question was just about looking at the different cultural and economic backgrounds of the scientists that are coming into a country like Greenland versus the local people, and what sort of challenges have you had related to your different cultural and economic backgrounds and the things you might care about as compared to the things they might care about?
And that's where it's been fascinating to see how much stronger our project is because of the pandemic, quite honestly. You know, we wrote this, we were gonna send a bunch of North American scientists around to each community each year. And instead, because we haven't been able to go to Greenland and we've chosen not to, we've leaned really heavily on our partners. So in fact, it's made it so much richer. And so it's that building local partners, I think, is so important, is what I've walked away with a sense of.
Thanks.
Fiamma.
Thanks, Tavi, and thanks, Robin. That was great to hear and very inspirational. So my question is perhaps for some of the early career scientists who might be watching this talk. So I know many of them would like to do more user-inspired research, including co-production of knowledge, but they're worried about an academic promotion system that very much still values the basic research, counts the publications, and many things about co-production of knowledge or in general involving stakeholders take a long time and maybe are not valued in our academic system right now. So I thought, you know, maybe you have some advice for them.
Right. You know, I think getting involved through the AGU has a Thriving Earth Exchange, which is a very nice way to get involved with science, directly connecting with communities, get trained and build a community and have that support system for you, particularly as an early career scientist. I think that's very good. I think those of us who are more senior, it's partially on our lap to make sure that we support cases that come up where the impact has been not just in the number of papers, but in the impact. You know, and over time at Lamont, I have watched the promotion criteria evolve to where it used to be not. Engineering didn't, building cool things to measure stuff didn't used to count. We changed that. And I'm now seeing the change towards, if you do science that say influences policy, guess what? You get credit for it. So I think it's, you know, I actually will flip it back to you and me, Fiamma. that it's our job, if we value this, to make sure that we articulate it in our communities and say that we must promote people to do this because we need our science to be impactful. So it's our job, Fiona.
We have another question from Maren Richter. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Lovely talk. I keep hearing more and more about the importance of not scaring people when we talk about climate change impacts, but at the same time, this increased sense of urgency that if we don't do something, preferably yesterday, things will go south really soon. How do you balance those two things in your public outreach?
Well, it really has been that shift towards we must take action now. We must all take action, and we must have this shared vision of a future that we want to live in together, and we want our children and our grandchildren to live together. So it's showing that change is happening, that we expect it to happen faster, but we must act now without focusing deeply on, I've just decided I can't scare people. It's unsustainable for me. And that I have to convey the sense of urgency through this vision of wanting to preserve our beautiful planet, our home, and whether it's the fish, the moon. I know we aren't going to save the moon. The moon's going to be fine. But the fish, the ability to go camping with your kids, or whether it's your garden or your home. That to me, that's been my only approach. I know that's probably not very helpful. But it is this balance. But I've decided drowning people's homes isn't as much fun as I used to have this awesome little railroad gauge snowman I love. But I decided that wasn't the right thing to do.
Great, thank you.
We've got a question on Facebook from Adam Cashton. He's asked, how should we best present glaciological information like glacier fluctuations or sea level rise to local communities? How to find a common language? I'll pop it on the chat if that's easier to read it than.
Yep. It's trying to use simple language that people, just pretend you're talking to your grandmother or your great uncle. And that's what I've found, is that we just have to use and that's why I have people touch their legs and try and put a face to it. That if and I always show a local sea level curve. And then I always show them New Orleans, and I show them, or I tell them about New Orleans going up. The sea level's going up really fast because New Orleans going down. And I also talk about, Fennoscandia, because in that map you can see those arrows going up. And somebody always asks, or down. Somebody else always asks that question, why are those arrows going down? It's like, well, there used to be an ice sheet there, and the Earth is bouncing up just the way it bounces up after you get out of off a couch. So it's, again, trying to use the language that you would use to describe it to your grandmother, your uncle. That's what I try and do.
Great, thanks. And Hester, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Robin. That was really clear, that progression. So my question is about, in a way, the us versus them. So it's still us scientists who are actually doing some of the planning, most of the decision making, most of the doing we indicate, and then the reporting, and then we decide about the co-authorship. So at all those levels, you also have to deal with authority in a way from the other side. So if you approach, any community, whether that is a collaborator in terms of science, other scientists, or a local community, there's an authority structure there too. So there can be inclusion and exclusion there. If you talk about marine fishing, often it's the men that are involved and the women are not. So do you have examples of how you actually dealt with that at all these levels, also at the planning and the decision making?
And it's fascinating because remember, we haven't been to Greenland since the first planning. So we have, except virtually, we've been in a lot of government and schools and some meetings with fishers. It's fascinating, and we still struggle with how we, first it's back to that, how do we have an impact? It was so powerful to realize that sharing those bathymetry maps, which all of us probably have on our computers, was so important, that community, because they didn't have them on their computers or anywhere. So we're still struggling with that question of, they don't care about publications, right? They care about the knowledge that will help them. So that's actually one of the conversations we were just having today, is how do we ensure we get back to the community what they need? So it's, Hester, it's a real ongoing challenge, and ask me in a year how we've done, because we're still working it out.
Can I say one more thing? So I'm in Canada right now, and since 2018, our Tri-Council, so the social healthcare and scientific community, we have to include kind of co-production and indigenous knowledge in it. So there are documents that answer some of these questions, and each different country has these documents. And it's not just the countries, like the Western countries, that have these documents, but also like Greenland itself. So in the planning, that is really important to actually like include the local like prescription of these rules as well.
And finding out what works with your local community. Because again, I bet we would find that what works in Canada doesn't necessarily work in Greenland.
Thank you very much indeed. Has anyone got any further questions? We seem to have run out on most platforms that I can see. Any last questions? I would like to invite everyone, of course, to next week's seminar, which is being given by Miriam Jackson, and I'm not sure if I can share the slide.
I put it up. I put it up.
Have you? Oh, thank you.
Or I'm trying.
Brilliant, thank you. I've only got one screen in front of me, so I usually have two, so it's all very complicated. But thank you so much, Robin, for that really inspiring and thought-provoking talk. I think we would all have taken a lot away from it, so thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everyone for attending, and hope to see you all next week. So
thanks, everybody.
Feel free to unmute or thanks.